This video gives you a step-by-step tutorial about installation of CrowdStrike Falcon agent on AWS EKS and Fargate. EKS stands for Elastic Kubernetes Cluster. EKS is Amazon Managed Kubernetes Service with Amazon provided Kubernetes control plane. EKS cluster can be configured to run workloads either on EKS nodes or on Fargate. With Fargate option, the worker nodes are managed by AWS. That is why in this case there is no ability to install software on the worker nodes running the cluster. Therefore, traditional Falcon kernel sensor cannot be supported and Falcon container sensor should be used instead. Let's have a quick overview of what exactly the Falcon container sensor is. The Falcon container sensor for Linux extends runtime security to container workloads in Kubernetes clusters that don't allow you to deploy the kernel-based Falcon sensor for Linux. The Falcon container sensor runs as an underprivileged container in user space with no code running in the kernel of that worker node operating system. This allows it to secure Kubernetes pods in cluster where it isn't possible to deploy the kernel-based Falcon sensor for Linux on the worker node, as is the case with Fargate, where organizations don't have access to the kernel and where privileged containers are disallowed. The Falcon container sensor can also secure container workloads on a cluster where worker node security is managed separately. Okay, let's have a look at the installation of Falcon Container Sensor or FCS on EKS Fargate. There are few prerequisites which you need to take care first. You need to have AWS CLI installed with access to your AWS account on your workstation where you'll be running these commands. Also, you need to have few tools installed like kubectl, EKSCTL, and Helm. You should already have an EKS cluster running. Also, make sure that you have Docker and Docker container runtime installed. You must have access to CrowdStrike portal and the API credentials there. And before you run anything else, make sure that the Docker daemon is up and running on your workstation. Cool. So let's begin the installation of FCS on this EKS. First and foremost, create the container, which will be your tooling container, or in other words, which will be where all the tools are pre-installed. So you just need to run this Docker command with privilege true with the image provided by the CrowdStrike. Okay, the next step is to create the Fargate profile for Falcon system namespace. So namespace is a virtual cluster where we will be placing all of our CrowdStrike Falcon related resources. And in this command, we are selecting region, giving our cluster name. So replace this cluster name with your own. And then after the Fargate profile is created, then there are few deployment steps of this Fargate Falcon. The first and foremost is to use the IAM OIDC controller for Fargate cluster and then create the container repository, which is in this case I'm doing in AWS ECR. After that, set the Falcon image URI within the ECR, and when that's done, simply push the Falcon container image to your ECR so that it could be downloaded later on when we deploy it. Another deployment step which we need to do is the configuration of IAM role and service account for Falcon Injector. When running on AWS Fargate, IAM roles associated with the Fargate nodes are not propagated to the running pods. This section describes the steps needed to create and associate an IAM role with a Kubernetes service account via the IAM OIDC connector to allow the Falcon Injector service to read container image information from the ECR private registry. Okay, so once that's done, make sure that you have already created this policy, because this policy which we are creating here, we are using here. Okay, and then we are attaching this policy with this IAM role to this service account. Okay, cool. Now, firstly set up your shell environment variables which are being used in this Helm commands, and these will be as per your requirement. Also, you need to use the same policy which we showed you earlier. And here we are basically just simply using Helm commands to install the Falcon container admission controller. Admission controller is Kubernetes service that intercepts requests to the Kubernetes API server. Falcon Container Sensor hooks to this service and injects Falcon Container Sensor to any new pod deployment on this cluster. In these steps, what we are doing is we are configuring and deploying the admission hook and the admission application through our Helm commands. And make sure that you already have obtained this CID from your CrowdStrike portal. Okay. Next thing which we need to do is to spin up the detection application in the EKS cluster. And then once that's done, and that's basically simply we are using the detection single YAML file provided by CrowdStrike. Once that's done, check the logs of this admission installer to ensure that it is responding to the detection app startup. Also ensure that a newly created pod was allocated an agent ID or AID in short from CrowdStrike Falcon platform. Once that's done, you should be able to see that the data from EKS from your containers is visible in the CrowdStrike portal. So that's pretty much the installation of CrowdStrike Falcon sensor onto your EKS cluster. If you have any questions or feedback, please put them in the comments. Thank you.